Today we are talking with Dr. Kendra Ross. She's an artist, she's an educator, she is so many more things than that. And I really think you're going to enjoy our conversation with her on today's PMEA's Take Note podcast. Hello, everybody. I'm Mark Despotakis, and welcome to this edition of PMEA's Take Note podcast. You know, one of the things that I really enjoy doing on this podcast is just finding interesting people that I think PMEA members, students, anyone listening to this in the music education space should know about. And today is one of those people, and I'm going to bring her in right now. I'm thrilled to have with us Dr. Kendra Ross. Kendra, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So I've known you for a few years now. And I've always tried to figure out, like, what's the right word for Kendra? What is Kendra? Is she an artist? Is she an educator? And as I look at your resume, you're kind of all of these things. You're an artist, you're an educator, you work on equity issues, you work on social issues. You have this great talent and I think desire to help other people advance their own careers. And then you were the head of social impact at Duolingo. But then it kind of clicked for me yesterday as I was reading the email you sent back to me, and I see your email signature. You define yourself as cultural worker. And maybe that helps actually define all of it. I'm curious, how do you define yourself?
You've done your homework, Mark. I was literally going to say the title, or kind of if one has to have a title or if it has to describe themselves in a couple of words of who they are and what they do, for me, it would be cultural worker. And what I mean by cultural worker is someone who, whether they be an artist or whether they be an organizer, entrepreneur, but someone rooted in the community whose work is meant to kind of drive the culture of that community through whatever means. So even as an artist, as I create art, I'm always thinking about how that is situated in the communities that I'm a part of and that want to push forward. And so you're right. When I think about myself, when I think about my work in whatever realm I'm in, it's not just about me, but it's always like very much rooted in community and my culture.
Yeah, and so let's dive into a few of those areas. We'll talk a little bit later about that you're an artist and some music that you have out there. But kind of maybe give us a little bit of a sketch of your career. Let's start even. This was a question for later, but I think we'll start there now. Like, let's talk about you're a product of Pittsburgh Public Schools.
Correct.
What was your experience there in music and arts programs? Because I'm guessing that helped put you into this trajectory of where you are now.
Absolutely. I tell anyone that asks, or even if they don't ask, that like I am a proud alumna of the Pittsburgh Public Schools K through 12. I would say that my music education started probably in the church. I grew up in the Baptist church here in Pittsburgh, but also in Ohio, where my grandfather was the pastor at the church, and my aunt was the minister of music. My mother was a choir director. My father is a musician. My uncle's a musician. So I grew up learning music, creating music first in church. But I guess my first kind of foray into like formal education in music was definitely in school. Probably starting with a dance school down the street from my mom's house called Rosalind Kenneth School of Dance. Rosalind Kenneth is a legendary dance teacher here in Pittsburgh, who her daughter, Rochelle Rack, went on to go on Broadway. And so that was my foundation of like arts education. But I would say my first kind of consistent music and arts education was in Pittsburgh Public Schools, first at Beechwood Elementary School in Beechview, then at Rogers Middle School, which is now part of Kappa. Kappa used to be just 9 through 12, and now it's 6 through 12. So the 6 through 8 piece of that was Rogers Middle School for the Creative and Performing Arts. So I was there, and then I was at Kappa for many years, up until the end of my junior year, and then I went on to Brashear. But I've always been in music or musical theater or dance, but music was always at the core of what I did.
So, and I mean, and obviously that create this foundation, for you, and we'll talk a little bit more about your career. But talk about like the impact of of those school years for you, those K to 12 years? Like, you kind of laid out, what you did, but how did that actually impact you personally? What did it do for you?
Well, I'll say first and foremost, some of my longest lasting friendships,
Mm,
friends who are now like family, who many of them are also artists, were found at Pittsburgh Public Schools. Um, Also recognizing the history and the rich cultural legacy of Pittsburgh, I learned from being in those schools, and so I was able to move through the world with a sense of pride about where I was from, and not, even though I was admittedly like everyone else who was was anxious about breaking out into the entertainment industry as a kid, was ready to move to New York and Los Angeles every other week.
mhm,
Uh, Foundationally, I knew that I came from a place where great art came from, where great musicians came from, um, the George Bensons of the world. I mean, I don't even want to start naming them because there's so many of them. So I knew I came from a rich cultural legacy, and I learned that from being at Pittsburgh Public Schools. Um, the friends and families I met, but I think also it's funny. I don't know what it's like at Kappa now, but Kappa and Rogers, when I was growing up, we were very serious about what we did. It was almost like we felt we were already had arrived to a certain extent. Maybe
yeah.
we were watching too much of Fame, because Fame was a TV show out when I was younger. So it wasn't quite as fun as Fame, where we were dancing on the lunch tables. But there was a certain seriousness to, like, okay, yeah, we're doing this thing, and we're gonna go on to Broadway, or we're gonna go on to be professional artists. And so that's just how I moved through the world. And that was a very unique experience, coming from a public school system where people think of the public school system as kind of not having all these resources. But we had great resources like the Center for Musically Talented, which I went to every Saturday from 9 to I think about 1, where we got theory and solfege and opera workshop. And we worked with some of the best musicians in Pittsburgh, from Pittsburgh Symphony and the opera, who were our teachers. And so I think we might have taken it for granted, but what I got from it was just like, man, like, no matter what socioeconomic status I came from, if I'm from Pittsburgh, like, I have an opportunity to, like, to learn from the best and become something.
So, and I'll just, mention, like, I think that actually, that is incredibly unique. And I think, from what I've seen, there are still pockets of that in Pittsburgh Public Schools. Maybe it's not like when you were there, but that is unique. That knowledge of, look what's happened in our community, and they're passing that along to the students. I don't think that's something you see in a lot of school districts around the state, probably even around the country. But when you can really point to it, especially in music and the arts, of the richness of Pittsburgh Public Schools, and then say to students, look, this is what's happened here.
Absolutely.
I think that is incredibly inspiring to students, and just inspiring to the community. So talk about then what happened after that. I mean, as I mentioned, like, you've done just so many things. Like, after you, what was your goal when you graduated high school, and then maybe where did your career actually take you?
No, that's a great question. First, I'll just step back to say, I think it's also important to note, you mentioned that there are pockets of what I'm talking about now in the school
Hmm.
system. It was not just Kappa and Rogers. Shinley High School, which no longer exists, which is now in the area, which would now, I guess, would be North Oakland, had some of the best musicals ever
Right.
produced by a high school in this region. And the Gene Kelly Awards that the Civic Opera produces always, acknowledge them in other schools. Some of the best classical musicians that we have out now, like Imani Winds, Monica Ellis, who just won a Grammy. She did go part-time to Kappa, but she also went to Shinley High School. So it was larger than just one or two schools. It was like, because of centers and the programming we had students from Aldice and other schools who had, just came from this excellence of music. As for me, getting out of school was an interesting. It was an interesting transition for me, because although I was at Kappa for most of my high school year, I actually got expelled from Kappa. Long story, and we can get into it if you want to, but being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I ended up going to Brashear, which is my kind of local high school, the high school closest to where I grew up. In high school, I would be assigned to if I weren't in a magnet program. And I graduated from there. And I was at this weird turning point where, when I was at Kappa, it was always understood that I would probably go to Carnegie Mellon, or, even if I went to a different school, it would always be somehow tied to, like, theater or music as my primary major. But, like, leaving Kappa when I did, although at the time was devastating for me, really opened me up that like actually I am academically gifted beyond this, and maybe I have something else to offer. And so I ended up leaving Brashear and going to NYU to major in music business and technology. And I don't know for sure if that would have happened if I had stayed at Kappa. I think there was so much push for me to like go to CMU, which is one of the best schools in the world. So it wouldn't be a bad thing, but to pursue theater or pursue music full time. But I started to think about myself more academically when I went to Brashear. And that's why I decided to major in music business, because I thought, although I'm an artist, maybe I can look at other ways to be active in this community. And one way is I had started exploring when I was before I left Kappa, but seriously, when I was at Brashear, like what would it be like to be on the business side of the music industry? What would it be like to perhaps pursue being an entertainment lawyer and being an artist? I had never thought about a quote unquote plan B when I was at Kappa, because all I knew was music and dance and theater. And there's nothing wrong with that being so, but I think a lot of who I am today is shaped by the fact that I left school when I did. And so I went to NYU, majored in music business and technology. And honestly, my first, in my 4 years of undergrad, I did singing here and there in New York, on campus programming with friends, but I wasn't doing it seriously. I wasn't pursuing a full-time career in music anymore because I was convinced like, oh yeah, like music business, I'm going to become a mogul. And if I want to perform, I can, but like, I should know the business. And I ended up on that trajectory, which was very interesting. And then eventually I realized, I'm an artist at heart, and I don't know what led me to believe that just because, I have these other skill sets and I get a degree in this other thing that I can't still pursue my dreams. And so what ended up happening is me living this dual life for most of my young adult life. So I worked in the music industry on the record label side, but at night I would record or I would perform. I started doing gigs as a background singer and as a solo artist all over New York. And some of the biggest artists that we know today in popular music were friends of mine who we just came up on the music scene together. For instance, the jazz musician Robert Glasper, people like that, or people I just knew who were coming up, who were at school together, at school at the same time. He was at the new school. Other artists that I can name, a good friend of mine, Abby Dobson. We all just came up together on the scene, and many of us took the full-time musician track, and some of us pursued another route.
I think that's such an important thing for students to hear, because like I'm one of these people who like firmly believes that everything happens for a reason. So like getting expelled from Kappa, which you can tell me that story at a happy hour sometime, like that like I'm sure at the moment it was like, oh no, right? But then like it probably happened for the reason to set you on this career path, to set you into the place where you've gone through your career.
I firmly believe that. And I should know, I always tell this story. What sealed the deal for me on that, would make me know that that was true, what you just said, Mark, is when I was an undergrad at Kappa, I remember sitting in my high school counselor's office with a couple of friends, maybe in 10th grade year, just talking about college and like what kind of colleges we would want to go to. And like I said, I was already playing around with the idea of like having a double major of like business and music when I was still at Kappa, but it wasn't something I thought about seriously. It just came to mind for me. I'm like, it'd be good to have another thing to think about. And I remember learning about NYU's program in music business at Kappa. And I remember my counselor saying to me, I don't think you'd get in there. They only accept a certain amount of students from each state every year. It's really hard to get in. You should think about some other schools. And at the time, I wasn't even seriously thinking about it. Mm-hmm. But to have someone tell me I wouldn't get in before like I even applied was like, it just stuck with me.
Yeah.
So when it did come time for me to look at applications for school, I applied to a lot of schools and I got into pretty much all of them. There was only one where they said, hey, we just need one more transcript from you. And I never sent it because I decided not to go there. But yeah, I ended up getting into NYU and I didn't think I'd be able to afford it. And my mother said, hey, if that's where you're going to go, we're going to work it out. We're going to figure it out. And that's where I went. And so that would have been probably a completely different story had I still been at Kappa. I probably wouldn't have gone to NYU because I'd have been like, my counselor told me not to apply,
Right. Yep. Life is so weird how it happens. So let's talk a little about the artist side. So you're still, you're back in Pittsburgh. You taught at Point Park for a while. You're at Duolingo, and maybe we'll get into that because that's fascinating too. But let's talk about the artist side. So you are still recording. You're still doing the work. In fact, just released a new single. So talk about the new single. Talk about, just the work you're doing in the artist space.
Absolutely. So it's funny. So like I said, I'll just kind of speed up a little bit the story. I had most of my 20s and 30s. I lived a dual life of being an artist and having a corporate gig. Then I started getting interested into academia a little bit because I would be at work like, okay, I've kind of figured out this like corporate thing. I think I can keep moving up in this, but like I think I've got it figured out. Now my brain is bored. There's got to be something else in the world. And that's when I started going back to school. Because after undergrad, I was like so worn out. I was like, I don't think I'm ever going back. But then I did. And I started pursuing academia. And so there was this thing of like, maybe I'll be an artist and a professor. That seems like a cool combination. And it just, I'm always curating a life, right? But it just kind of never came together. So then when I left New York about 9.5 years ago now, I said, I'm going to move back home because it will give me the space to like create the life I want to without focusing just on how I'm paying rent. That was 2014. The cost of living in Pittsburgh was still really low. I mean, it's still lower now than most cities, but it was like super low. Like it was really, really, really affordable. And I just thought, I could go to Pittsburgh and do anything or maybe I can consult and I'll pursue my art. And honestly, I did most of everything else but that. Initially, I was performing here and there. I did some gigs here. But then I got really wrapped up in working in the community, specifically the Hill District, working with artists and arts organizations in the Hill District and organizing those organizations and artists to kind of uplift the cultural legacy, African-American cultural legacy of the Hill District, which is really important work that I'm proud of and I still am a part of. But that really became my focus. It wasn't until later that I learned that itself was an artistic practice, that cultural organizing is considered an artistic practice. I didn't have the language for that then. So I wasn't really focused on my own music. So there had been, I put out an album years ago, I had put out singles here and there, and I had recorded an album, the better part of an album that I had never put out maybe 10 years ago. And then I started working a new EP, and I said to myself last year, Kendra, you've done so much work that you haven't shared, and you beat yourself up about not being in this creative space every year after year because you have all these other things going on. You're a professor, now you're a PhD student, now you're a tech executive or whatever it is you say I am. And so I said, what I'm going to do is, yes, I'll continue to create music. Yes, I'll find ways to express myself and perform. But how about you start to put out some of the music that you created? Because I wasn't making like pop music that like, if I didn't put it out that year, it'd be dated. I was making like songs with bands and, composing it. And so actually the song that you're referring to, Hideous Want, I'll let you in on a little secret. I recorded that song probably 10 years ago.
Okay.
And I just went to my producer and / guitar player in New York and said, hey, I need you to finish whatever edits you want. He's a perfectionist and he wanted to refix his guitar solo. And so I said, fix your guitar solo. Let's go take it to the studio and let's mix and master it. And that's what we did. And I have a couple of more things that I had recorded around that time that are like, I believe to be timeless songs, not because I wrote them, but just because of the process and the people I worked with that I'm going to continue to release. And then I'm also, at the same time, I received a generous grant from the Advancing Black Arts Grant Program, which is a collaboration between the Pittsburgh Foundation and the Heinz Endowments. I received that in 2021 or 21, maybe. And so I started a new EP called This Womanist Work, which is EP just about my kind of evolution as a woman growing older. And I collaborate on that EP with all women producers, songwriters, musicians, singers, and poets. And so that I plan to also put out hopefully this year. And so yeah, I've been working off and on. I've never stopped being an artist. I just haven't always shared it with the world.
Yeah. So let's and we'll put up the links where people can find that. Find your work. I think your website's kendraross.com, so
Correct.
they can find it from there. So I want to touch a little bit on Duolingo. So sure. You were in these spaces that were I would say pretty closely in the arts and music. I mean, even when you were at Point Park, and then you go to Duolingo, which is is language learning, but then you're going there to work as head of social impact.
Correct.
Which is I'm sure, a fascinating role that most corporations, companies don't even have. Why the switch? What is it that you're doing there? And, like what's the progress you've made so far?
Great question. So yeah, this is my first job that's not like a collegey job, right? Like I've been a hostess or like I worked at a boutique, right? But like this is my first like real grown-up job that's not related to the music or arts in any way. Which actually it is related because I've made it related, but it was not intended for that. So yeah, uh I was at Universal Music Group. So my the job that I was at the longest that was associated with me for the most of my career was working in label operations for Universal Music Group, which is the biggest music company in the world. I was there for 17 years, actually a little longer if you included previous years that I worked there off and on as a temp and as a contractor. And I left there in 2019. And at that time, I was getting close to the dissertation stage of my PhD in community engagement at Point Park. So once I moved back home to Pittsburgh and I was trying to kind of find my space in the world, instead of becoming a full-time artist, I became a graduate student again because I found this program called community engagement. And it was about how do we bring together people from the public sector, the private sector, the government sector to solve social issues and help to improve communities. And it just spoke to me when I saw it. And I'm like, I'm not sure how I fit into this, but I'm going to make it work. And I was still working for my company in New York, but I was working remotely here in Pittsburgh, working on my PhD. And then I just decided, it's time to really take the leap. And that's when I thought I was going to move into my dream of becoming a professor / full-time artist. Became a professor of sports arts and entertainment management. Was doing that full-time, loved my students, but the pandemic hit and things got weird. They thought they weren't going to renew some of our contracts. That ended up being not possible since we were a union. But it just put a nasty taste in my mouth about took a pay cut to leave corporate to come work in academia, and I'm already so precarious in my second year as a full-time professor, and I love my students and I love teaching, but I need to think about my future and where is the best place for me to make impact. So I've never taken a job because of money. I couldn't have working in entertainment because they're contrary to popular belief, most people in entertainment don't make a lot of money unless you are the top of the line of the star. Most of us don't make a lot of money. I took a pay cut and did all this to make these changes, but I need to start thinking about my future and the future of my impact. And around the time when I wasn't sure what was happening with my contract with the university, I'd always said, I don't see myself working in Pittsburgh. It's pretty conservative. I spent most of my working years in New York. I can't imagine myself working anywhere except maybe Duolingo, which was just like a joke at a certain point. I'm like, what am I going to do with Duolingo? I'm not an engineer. But I just remember these billboards they would have in Manhattan that said, move to Pittsburgh, own a home, work at Duolingo or something like that. And that was a campaign they had to convince people to move to Pittsburgh to work at Duolingo. And I remembered it. And I remember seeing it. So I was like, oh, maybe I'd work at Duolingo. And around that time, a couple of months later, sure enough, my partner said, hey, you should look at this job, and I looked at it and it said head of social impact, and I read it and I'm like, I've never done these things in this order, but this is basically what I got my PhD in, right? Is to take what I know and use it to build a mutually beneficial relationship with the community to help build community. And so it was a long shot, but I went for it and I applied, and it just, after my first interview, I said, oh, this is my job. I'd never thought I wanted to do anything but being music and entertainment or, teach. But I was like, this job it was made for me. And I made it my mission to get it. I started to eat, drink, sleep, everything Duolingo, all the executives. I learned everything about the company. I'd already used the app before. So it wasn't like it was, it was completely foreign to me, and I became obsessed with it. And sure enough, as luck would have it, I got the job, and I found out that one of the first things I'd be working on is, lo and behold, a community arts program that they started, which they hadn't really flushed out. They had people working on it as an aside to their day jobs. And I was able to pick it up and expand it. And I'm like, this was a sign that even in a job that felt completely removed from anything that I had ever done, I still get to work with artists and arts organizations and make decisions about this. And so it just felt really good. It feels really good. I love what I do. My job is to kind of handle all of our philanthropic giving, the ways we engage with community, with government, ways we engage civically. I love my city. I was one of these people that says, I've critiqued it. I ran away from it and I came back and I said, if I'm going to be here, I'm going to be the change that I want to see in it. And I've been given so many platforms to do that through Unisound, through my work with the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra, through my work with Arts and HD in the Hill District, through my consulting with my partners, through Act 3 Consulting Partners. And now through my work with Duolingo, I feel so blessed to be able to get paid very well to do work that benefits my community. And I still get to engage with artists and nonprofit leaders and folks who want to make this the best city that we can make it. So I'm really happy with where I am. And I still have time to sit here in my little office and tinker around and continue to make my music.
Yeah. I think the theme of today's podcast is everything happens for a reason.
Absolutely.
So I got to know you through Unisound. You mentioned Unisound, which is an organization in Pittsburgh of out of school based music ensembles, youth symphonies, youth orchestras, those types of groups. And so we're on the steering committee together. Met you there, a few years ago. But one of the big programs that we do it's called the BTAR program, the Black Teaching Artist in Residence, and we had Emily Boven from Unisound on the podcast a few months ago to talk about it as well. But you've really helped to make that happen. Not only through Unisound, but through, you mentioned Act 3 Consulting, have come together to make that happen. So I'm curious because I would love for you to talk about this a little bit more, because we're in a period of time where, that program's expanding. Is the goal. So if you could just talk a little bit about it, the need for it, and how that evolved, because you were on board before I was, when it was really getting started.
Absolutely. So, for me, working with Unisound initially it's everything happens for a reason. So I initially met Lindsay Nova, who is the executive director of Three Rivers Young People's Orchestras, who is our fiscal sponsor with Unisound. I met her at a convening that Hines did of organizations working, I think, mostly in arts and culture at the time, many years ago. And someone connected us and we said, hey, we should link up about something. And I told her my passion and my dream was to see that Centers for the Musically Talented came back. And we had a discussion about it. And Centers for the Musically Talented, which I mentioned before, was a free program for any student of Pittsburgh Public Schools who show high proficiency in music in high school, to attend this like basically a conservatory type intensive on Saturdays. I think it was from 8 to 11 or 8 to 12 or whatever, every Saturday. Was it every Saturday? I think it was every Saturday. It was at least a couple Saturdays a month. In any case, at what was Peabody High School, which is now Obama Academy. And it was incredible. Like, our opera was taught by people from the Pittsburgh Opera Company. All the instrumentals came from either the Pittsburgh Symphony or, just professional musicians around the city. So a lot of our students were going to governor's school, were then going on. Some of them decided to go on and become engineers or doctors, but they got a conservatory quality level music education. And we did that by attending Centers for Musically Talented. And I told her, I said, my passion is that would exist again, because I think some of the best musicians in the world came out of the city, but it's gotten to the point where it's not tenable to even be a working musician here anymore, unless you have a gig as a teacher at one of the colleges at Kappa, or you're in the symphony, right? And so when she told me, what she was thinking about, we talked about it, and then we kind of lost touch. And then when Unisound was being formed, they said, we're looking for a community engagement consultant, and someone mentioned me. And she and I connected again. And initially my goal was to work with Unisound to help to make sure that we had a diverse array of arts organizations, music organizations that work with young people out of school time at the table, not just the large ones or the suburban ones or the well-resourced ones, but of all backgrounds. And we started to do that work, and we've made a lot of headway. We never had a full-time employee. We eventually got the wonderful Emily Boven, who actually was one of my first students when I became a professor at Point Park, who I love. And then the pandemic hit, and we said, okay, what do we do now? And it just so happened that Linda from Hope Academy and Lindsay and Emily and I had conversations before about, like, what would it look like to us to have program, a fellowship program, to make sure we can bring more diversity to the like instrumental teaching pipeline. But for me, it just felt like a moment between what happened with the pandemic, between what happened with everything, the uprising that came about after George Floyd's murder. What felt like the best thing that we could do with the resources that we already had that aligned with the mission of Unisound. And that's where the Black Teaching Artists in Residence was really born, came out of early conversations and us saying, hey, there are Black teaching artists, Black musicians in this city who are, despite the circumstances of where we're in, despite being some of the most talented musicians, are driving Uber, are working a million shifts at other places, trying to keep it together, and they're still doing teaching artist work. What would it look like for us to support them as artists and teaching artists so that they can focus on improving their practice, so that we can make sure that we continue to have a diverse pipeline of instrumental vocal music teachers who are also practicing artists? Because that's the thing, is a lot of times folks have to spend so much time just trying to survive and be teaching artists that they lose sight of their practice. And so initially it was really about providing a stipend and professional development and support for teaching artists to continue in their artistic practice, and at the same time to build a mutually beneficial relationship, having those folks who have access, hands-on access to like the pulse of what's going on with our students, particularly students from marginalized backgrounds, speak to what we should be doing as a community as Unisound. And so far we are on our fourth cohort. Yeah, we're on our fourth cohort of Black teaching artists. And we learn from each one. They're all very different. Some show up differently than others, but we learn from each one. And it's just been really rewarding work, I think.
Yeah, and you're right. It's fascinating as we watch what, how because they have been so different.
Yes.
In great ways.
Yes.
And so now the next step that it evolves is to hopefully attract someone to Pittsburgh as a full-time position. Absolutely. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. Thank you for, I think I was supposed to tie that in earlier. Sorry. Yeah. So initially the Black teaching artists in residence that we had in phase one was really about honoring who was already here in Pittsburgh doing the work. But we also recognize that there is still a gap, right? It was brought to our attention first by Linda from Hope Academy, who said, I have some amazing teaching artists who are teaching string and violin to students in the community, many of whom are Black and brown. And the teachers themselves are saying, we love what we're doing, but we're doing these children a disservice by not having folks who look like them in the space to also be here to show them that this is possible for them. So basically saying, it's great that we're doing this work and we're happy to teach these children. We love these children, but how are we showing these children that there's a lane for them in this space if there's no one here who looks like them? And we recognize there was a huge gap in specifically, teachers of, violin, viola, who were Black and brown, especially for younger kids, maybe at the college level, but we're talking about folks just kind of starting out. And that's where we started to come up with this next step, which is more like a Black Teaching Artist Fellowship for musicians, I would say emerging career musicians, those who may have just finished conservatory or just finished college, but have some teaching experience under their belt, want to further develop and be able to, make a full-time career out of being a teaching artist and a practicing artist, to bring them to Pittsburgh, provide housing stipend and transportation stipend and a salary position where they would partner with Unisound as kind of the, managing the role, but work with Hope Academy and Guardians of Sound, the hip hop orchestra, who also works out of the same space as Hope Academy, to provide private lessons and group lessons for students in our community in string instruments. And we're working really hard on that. It's been harder than we thought to find the right person. I think it's just a combination of like offering better storytelling until like what the position is. Also better storytelling about what it's like to be an artist in Pittsburgh. It's actually, for me, Pittsburgh is it's hard everywhere, right? When you're trying to be an artist and it's not always valued being a musician. But to me, Pittsburgh has the potential to be a place where like musicians could really like thrive, and we can have working and middle class musicians, which I think is the sign of a really healthy and robust ecosystem, when we have people of all socioeconomic statuses being able to do what they do in their field. And we want to cultivate that. And we hope that folks who come in for the fellowship, which is whether they come for the 2-year fellowship, that they would want to stay and we could find space for them through our vast network of teaching artist opportunities here in the city.
And I would encourage people to visit unisound.us to just find out more about the program, and you can see the previous BTARs and their work. I think it's a fantastic program. So, all right, in our remaining time, I want to get some big picture, get your thoughts on some big picture things. So, what has come through a lot through what you've told us is, I think you have this passion for Pittsburgh and how it can be better. Is that an accurate assessment?
Absolutely.
And how can it be better?
I'm glad you asked me. Whenever I get a chance to answer this question or have this conversation, I jump at it. For me, when I left Pittsburgh, when I left Pittsburgh the first time, right when I left high school to come to college in New York in the 90s, Pittsburgh was not a place that I thought I'd come back to. I didn't feel like there was anything that was going to be here for me to come back to, particularly as a Black woman, who was an artist. I just didn't feel like what I had to offer in the world was going to be valued here. And then I started coming home during breaks. Okay, I see what you're doing, Pittsburgh. Then I got a little older, and 2 of my best friends moved back from Atlanta and Maryland, respectively. And I said, okay, wait a minute. There's something here. And it felt like a different city. It didn't feel completely like, oh yeah, this is it. This is, I everything I need is here. But it felt like, oh man, like if folks who knew what Pittsburgh was to see what it's come from would come and take advantage and say, okay, I see what you all did. I'm going to take up the mantle now. Let's help push it to that next step. That we're getting somewhere, and we're getting somewhere. And even since in the 9.5 years since I've been here, I've seen even more change and evolution in our political system, in our nonprofit sector, in our private sector. But overall, I think there is still very much an issue with what I call the succession planning problem, in that there are a small group of people who have had the power in this very small city, who, instead of taking this opportunity to say, hey, there's some folks here who either came back, or some young folks sticking around who want to do some work, instead of really like pouring into them in succession planning, they're holding on the power and say, hey, you can come do this, but you can do it as long as I get to hold my power. And I think, to me, that is the biggest detriment and one of the biggest problems facing Pittsburgh across race, gender, socioeconomic status. But, in particular, like, this is a place that if you don't come from a small group of people, there's a certain small group of people who have the power. If you don't have access to them, it could be to your detriment, whether they be in the foundation community, whether they be in certain corporate communities, old families. This is an old money city. And so I think we can coexist together. I think we can be great together. But if a small group of people are determined to hold on to power and not give up the reins of that power to other folks who are willing to stay here and to come here and do the work, and just allow them to not just to be workers, but also to take up the mantle of some of that power, so that we can make sure that we can maintain continuity over generation after generation and still maintain that multi-generational collaboration. That, to me, is one of Pittsburgh's biggest downfalls. I see it every day, where like nonprofit leaders sometimes won't leave until they have to leave. And then by the time they leave, there's no one in line behind them because the person gives up. And then we have to do a national search, and we bring someone in that doesn't know anything about Pittsburgh. They come in, then they don't feel welcomed, and then they leave. And it's just like a cycle. I think, to me, and I don't mind saying this publicly, I say it all the time, I think that's our biggest issue. We have some of the most talented, giving, kind, renowned folks in the city, coming out of the city, and far too often I see them saying, okay, I give up, I can't do it anymore.
There's a lot there that we can unpack, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the next topic, but we'll unpack those. We'll add that to the happy hour list. Cause there's some really interesting points that you make, that I'd love to follow up with at some point, but I want to get your thoughts on another bigger picture thing. So
absolutely,
you're involved outside of Pittsburgh, quite a bit, in your work, in your artistry. You're on the board of governors for the Philadelphia chapter of the Recording Academy. As you take a look at the larger performing arts community, what changes do you feel need to be made to make that sector better for everyone and a better system for everyone?
I think we have to be aware of, but resist the impulse to follow everything that's happening in the political climate right now. For instance, this situation we're in right now, where everybody wants to like make DEI a bad word, a taboo thing, flip DEI on its head and call it racist. And I say that because in the Recording Academy, I've been a part of the Recording Academy since 2010. I didn't become an active member, meaning being on the board and all that kind of stuff, until 2002, I think. And I've seen it change a lot. I've seen the leadership change. It's become a lot more diverse, not just in terms of race, but in more gender parity. We still have a long way to go, but I've seen the work being done. I've seen folks being critiqued and corrected, and seeing things happen. I've seen movement. And it's because the Recording Academy has leaned into the changes that said, hey, if we want to have the music industry of the future, we have to recognize that it's going to take all of us. It can't just be relegated for this small group of people. I looked at like the old national trustee boards for years were always primarily white men in the Recording Academy, as it is across most industries, and it's not like that anymore. It's evolved, and it's a lot more diverse. The Board of Governors in Philadelphia is one of the most diverse boards of all the regional boards in the country. And so I use the Recording Academy as an example of what is possible. If when we just say that we're aware of what's happening politically, we go to Washington and advocate on Capitol Hill for issues affecting our community as well, but we recognize that we cannot be so tethered to that world that we lose sight of like what the future looks like. We cannot afford to say, well, this is what happened in the political climate, so we have to shy away from this, because it's going to set us all back. Performing arts is really about humanity. It's about the world and like who we are and how we show up in this world as humans. And if we can't acknowledge the fact that diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging is about all of us and embracing all of us, and that it's going to feel to some people like, oh, in the correcting of this, I feel like I'm being oppressed. Well, you feel like that because you've been in a privileged position for so long. When we don't recognize that, like, it is vital for the future of our sector to be as inclusive and as diverse as possible, then we're gonna see devastating effects that we've already seen as a result of the pandemic, audience cultivation and things like that. So yeah, I think that's my biggest concern, but I'm also very hopeful about it based on what I see in my own kind of organization.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like the idea is to pull out of the news cycle a little bit. Yeah. And do the work in your space and understand your own space and do that work and let that be what it's going to be, because it's not going away, and acknowledge it's there, but do the work in your space.
Correct. I think that's a great way to put it, like pull out of the news cycle a little bit. That like the news cycle is going to be there, and like we have to be aware of it, but we can't allow it to motivate us to zigzag, otherwise we'll just,
Yeah. Well, Kendra, this has been absolutely fascinating to learn some things that I didn't know about you and to get your thoughts on things. I will tell folks, go to kendraross.com to learn even more. And then from there, you can also find some of her musical works, but you can also search on YouTube and find them as well. Kendra, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you all for joining us on this edition of PMEA's Take Note podcast. We want to thank our sponsor, the Grove City College Department of Music. We'll see you next time.